I never thought a puddle could bankrupt a rancher, but when I watched my cattle standing knee-deep in cracked mud where Clear Creek used to flow, I realized the Ridgemont HOA had just declared war on my livelihood. My name is Samuel Xavier, and I own a 2,000-acre cattle ranch in northern Colorado that my grandfather bought in 1952. The land stretches across rolling hills dotted with ponderosa pines, and right through the middle of it runs Clear Creek, or at least it used to. That creek was the lifeblood of my operation, feeding my livestock, irrigating my hayfields, and keeping the whole ecosystem balanced. Without it, I was watching 70 years of family legacy turn to dust. It started 3 months ago when the Ridgemont Estates development went up on the plateau east of my property. Someone with more money than sense decided that the foothills of the Rockies needed a gated community full of McMansions, complete with a golf course, artificial lakes, and an HOA so aggressive they probably measured grass blades with calipers. The development sat upstream from my ranch, and at first I figured we would coexist like neighbors should. I was wrong. The first time I met Patricia Whitmore, the HOA president, she showed up at my ranch in a white Mercedes SUV that had probably never seen a dirt road before that day. She wore cream-colored slacks that cost more than my best horse and sunglasses big enough to cover half her face. She was maybe 50, with that aggressively highlighted blonde hair that suburban women seem to think looks natural, and a smile that never reached her eyes. "Mr. Xavier," she said, not bothering to shake my hand. "I'm Patricia Whitmore, president of the Ridgemont Estates HOA. We need to discuss the creek situation." I wiped sweat from my forehead. It was early June, and I had been fixing fence all morning. "What about it?" "Well, our community needs adequate water resources for our amenities. The creek runs through our property before it reaches yours, and we have certain rights we intend to exercise." She said it like she was explaining something to a child. "Clear Creek has been flowing to this ranch for over a century," I said, keeping my voice level. "My grandfather built his whole operation around it." "That may be, but we have a lawyer who says differently. We just wanted to give you a courtesy notice that we'll be making some adjustments to the water flow. Good day." She turned on her heel and walked back to her pristine SUV, leaving me standing there wondering what the hell just happened. 2 weeks later, the creek started drying up. At first, I thought it was just a drought, but when I rode up to the property line, I saw what they had done. The HOA had built a series of berms and diversions that redirected 90% of Clear Creek's flow into their artificial lakes and irrigation systems for their golf course. They left barely a trickle coming downstream to my property. I called my lawyer, Jim Patterson, a guy I had known since high school who now practiced water law in Fort Collins. He came out to survey the situation, took photos, and shook his head. "This is bad, Sam, real bad. They're violating your water rights, but fighting this could take years in court. Colorado water law is complicated as hell, and they probably have a team of lawyers on retainer." "So what do I do? Just watch my ranch die?" "I'll file an injunction, but don't hold your breath. The courts are backed up, and the HOA will fight every step." He looked at my dried-up creek bed and sighed. "In the meantime, you might want to look into hauling water or drilling new wells." Hauling water for a 2,000-acre ranch with 300 head of cattle is not just expensive, it is financially catastrophic. I did the math, and within 6 weeks, I would burn through my savings. Within 3 months, I would have to start selling cattle at a loss. Within 6 months, I would lose everything. I spent the next month in a fog of stress and anger. My wife, Emma, had passed away from cancer 2 years earlier, and my daughter Sophia lived in Denver working as an engineer. The ranch was all I had left, the only connection to my family history that still meant something tangible. Watching it slowly die because some HOA decided they needed a prettier golf course made me feel helpless in a way I had not experienced since Emma's diagnosis. Patricia Whitmore called me twice during that month. The first time, she offered to buy my ranch for about 30% of its actual value. "Given the water situation, I think you'll find our offer quite generous," she said with that fake smile in her voice. I hung up on her. The second time, she threatened to sue me for agricultural runoff pollution affecting their community. I hung up on her again. By mid-July, things were desperate. I'd started hauling water in tanks, but it was like trying to fill an ocean with a teaspoon. My hayfields were dying. My cattle were stressed and losing weight. I was losing sleep, barely eating, and spending every waking hour trying to keep the operation alive. That is when I got the call from Henry Blackthorne. He was a retired civil engineer in his 70s who lived in the mountains west of my property. I'd met him a few times at the feed store, and he always struck me as the kind of guy who knew everything about everything. "Sam, I heard about your trouble with the HOA," he said. "You got time for an old man to bend your ear?" I drove up to his cabin that afternoon. It was a beautiful log structure tucked into the pines with a view that stretched for miles. Henry was waiting on his porch with 2 beers and a stack of papers. "Sit down, son. I did some research." He spread the papers across a wooden table. "You know where Clear Creek comes from? Up in the mountains somewhere? Specifically, it comes from Lake Moriah, about 15 miles northwest of here. That lake is held back by Moriah Dam, built in 1967 by the Bureau of Reclamation. Here's the interesting part. The dam was sold to a private company in 2003 as part of a federal asset liquidation. That company went bankrupt in 2019, and the dam went to auction. It was bought by a holding company called Mountain West Water Holdings." "Okay," I said, not seeing where this was going. Henry grinned. "Mountain West Water Holdings is owned by one person, Gerald McKinney, who died last year. His estate has been trying to sell off his assets, and the dam is one of them. It has been on the market for 8 months with no buyers because, frankly, who wants to own a dam? It is nothing but liability and maintenance costs." The idea hit me like a lightning bolt. "How much?" "They are asking $200,000. I bet you could get it for $150,000. I sat back and looked at the mountains. "If I own the dam, I control the water." "Exactly. Clear Creek flows from Lake Moriah. You control the dam, you control the release. You could send every drop of that water right back where it belongs." Henry took a sip of his beer. "Or you could shut it off entirely and watch their fancy golf course turn into a desert." "That is crazy." "Crazy like a fox. You got $150 in equity?" I did some quick mental math. If I mortgaged every acre I owned, pulled everything from my retirement accounts, and maxed out my lines of credit, I could maybe scrape together $170,000. It would leave me with nothing in reserve, but at this point, I was already staring at bankruptcy. It would wipe me out. "So will doing nothing," Henry said. "At least this way you go down swinging." I called Jim Patterson that night and explained the plan. There was a long silence on the other end of the phone. "Sam, that is either the smartest or the dumbest thing I have ever heard. Let me look into the legal situation. If you buy that dam, the HOA could argue you are using it to cause them harm. But if you are just restoring the natural water flow that existed before their diversions, you might have a case." "Might?" "Water law is complicated. Give me a few days to research." Those few days felt like years. I barely slept, running scenarios in my head. I imagined Patricia Whitmore's face when she realized what I had done. I imagined the golf course turning brown, their artificial lakes shrinking, and their precious property values plummeting. But I also imagined my creek flowing again, my cattle drinking clean water, and my hayfields turning green. Jim called me back on a Thursday morning. "Okay, here's the situation. If you purchase Moriah Dam, you acquire the water rights associated with it, including the historical right to release water downstream through Clear Creek. The natural flow pattern predates the Ridgemont development by decades, so you would be legally justified in restoring it. The HOA's diversions are actually the illegal modification, not your restoration of natural flow. That said, they will absolutely sue you, and it will get ugly." "How ugly?" "They will claim you are deliberately harming them, trying to manipulate water resources for revenge, causing property damage, every angle their lawyers can think of. You will need to document everything, prove you are just restoring historical flow patterns, and be prepared for a long legal fight. The upside is that you would actually have the upper hand for once. They need water from that creek, and if you control the source, you control the negotiation." "What do I need to do?" "First, buy the dam. Second, hire a hydrologist to document the historical flow patterns of Clear Creek before the HOA's modifications. Third, prepare for war. because Patricia Whitmore is not going to take this lying down. I spent the next week gathering every dollar I could. I met with my bank manager, a woman named Carol, who had known my family for decades. When I explained what I needed and why, she looked at me like I had grown a second head. "Sam, this is incredibly risky. If something goes wrong, you could lose everything." "If I do nothing, I definitely lose everything. At least this way, I have a chance." She processed the paperwork, but I could see the worry in her eyes. "I hope you know what you are doing." I contacted the estate lawyer handling the sale of Moriah Dam and made an offer of $155,000, which was everything I could scrape together. They countered at $170,000. After 2 days of negotiation, we settled at $162,000. I signed more paperwork than I had ever seen in my life, and just like that, I owned a 60-year-old concrete dam in the Colorado mountains. The day I took ownership, I drove up to see it. The road was rough, barely maintained, winding through pine forests and across rocky ridges. When I finally reached the dam, I understood why nobody wanted to buy it. Moriah Dam was not some impressive feat of engineering like Hoover Dam. It was a relatively small concrete gravity dam, maybe 70 feet tall and 200 feet across, holding back a lake that was perhaps a mile long and half a mile wide. It looked solid enough, but it was clearly aging, with stains streaking down the concrete and vegetation growing in the cracks. There was a small control house at one end with rusty equipment inside. The release gates were operated by ancient manual wheels that looked like they belonged in a submarine. According to the documentation, the dam normally released a steady flow to maintain downstream water rights and environmental flows. Someone from the previous owner's company had been coming up once a month to check on it, but that had stopped when the company went bankrupt. I spent an hour exploring, taking photos and trying to understand how everything worked. The main release valve controlled the flow into Clear Creek. It was currently set to release about 30 cubic feet per second, which sounded like a lot until you realized the HOA was diverting most of that before it reached my property. According to the historical records Henry had found, the traditional release rate that maintained the creek for decades was closer to 75 cubic feet per second. I called Henry and put him on speakerphone. "I am looking at the controls. How hard is it to adjust the release?" "You see those big wheel valves? The one on the left controls the primary gate. Turning it counterclockwise opens the gate more. Clockwise closes it. There should be a gauge showing the release rate. Start slow, Sam. You do not want to cause flooding. Just restore normal flow." I studied the gauge. It was old and the glass was cloudy, but I could read it, currently showing 32 cubic feet per second. I grabbed the wheel and started turning. It was stiff, fighting me every inch, but gradually it moved. The gauge needle crept up. 35, 40, 50. I could hear the water rushing through the release tunnel beneath my feet, a deep thrumming that vibrated through the concrete. At 75 cubic feet per second, I stopped. This was the historical average, the amount that Clear Creek had carried for decades before the development. I was not trying to flood anyone or cause damage. I was just putting things back the way they were supposed to be. The water would take about 6 hours to reach the HOA development and another 2 hours after that to reach my ranch. I drove home, my heart pounding, and waited. Around 8 that evening, I got the first call from Patricia Whitmore. I let it go to voicemail. She called again 10 minutes later. Again to voicemail. The third time, my curiosity got the better of me, and I answered. "What did you do?" she screamed, and I had to hold the phone away from my ear. "Our lakes are flooding. Water is pouring through our drainage systems. You are destroying our property." "I did not do anything," I said calmly. "I simply adjusted the release rate at Moriah Dam to its historical average. Clear Creek is flowing at the same rate it flowed for decades before your development existed." "You bought the dam. You cannot do that. That is illegal. That is harassment. That is me exercising my legal rights as the dam owner. The Bureau of Reclamation's original specifications called for that release rate. I am just following the guidelines. Our golf course is flooding. Our retention ponds are overflowing. You're going to pay for every dollar of damage." "Maybe you should not have built your development in a floodplain," I said, "and maybe you should not have stolen my water. I'm just putting things back to normal." She hung up on me. I walked outside and looked toward the east where my creek bed lay dry and cracked. It would be hours before the water arrived, but I felt hopeful for the first time in months. My phone rang again. Jim Patterson. Sam, I just got a very angry call from the HOA's lawyer. They are threatening to file for an emergency injunction tomorrow morning. What did you do? I restored the creek to its historical flow rate. How much water are we talking? 75 cubic feet per second, same as it has been for decades. And their property is flooding? Apparently, but that's not my problem. They built in a floodplain without accounting for the actual creek flow. They assumed they could just steal the water and nobody would stop them. Jim laughed. Actually laughed. Oh man, this is going to be fun. Okay, here's what we do. Get that hydrologist out there immediately. We need documentation of the historical flow rates, evidence that you are just restoring normal conditions, and expert testimony that the HOA's development was improperly designed. If they want to fight, we will bury them in data. I called Dr. Sarah Chen, a hydrologist from Colorado State University that Jim recommended. She agreed to come out first thing in the morning. Then, I walked down to my creek bed and waited. Around 10:30, I heard it before I saw it. A soft, gurgling sound, growing louder, echoing off the rocks. I turned on my flashlight and pointed it downstream. A dark line was advancing along the creek bed, water spreading across the dried mud and sand. It was the most beautiful thing I had seen in months. The water kept coming, growing from a trickle to a stream to a proper creek. Within an hour, Clear Creek was flowing again, just like it had my entire life. I stood there in the darkness, listening to the sound of moving water, and felt tears running down my face. I was not a man who cried often, but this felt like resurrection. By morning, the creek was running strong and clear. My cattle found it within an hour, gathering along the banks to drink. I walked the length of my property, checking the flow, and everywhere I looked, there was water. My land was coming back to life. Dr. Chen arrived at 9 with a trunk full of equipment. She was in her 40s, energetic and professional, with short black hair and the focused intensity of someone who loved her work. We spent the entire day surveying the creek, taking measurements, and reviewing historical data. She took water samples, measured flow rates at multiple points, and photographed everything. This is fascinating, she said as we stood by the creek in the afternoon sun. You can see the damage the drought caused, but the creek is already recovering. The bed structure is intact, the gravel deposits are good, and the riparian vegetation will bounce back quickly. This is a healthy creek system that was artificially deprived of water. Can you document that? Absolutely. I will need about a week to compile all the data, but I can definitively show that this flow rate is consistent with historical patterns going back decades. The HOA's diversions were the aberration, not your restoration. While we worked, my phone kept ringing. Patricia Whitmore called 6 times. The HOA's lawyer called 4 times. I ignored all of them. I was done negotiating with people who thought they could bully me off my own land. That evening, Jim called with news. The HOA filed for an emergency injunction. There's a hearing scheduled for Monday morning. They are claiming you are deliberately flooding their property and demanding the judge order you to reduce the release rate. What are our chances? Honestly, pretty good. I spoke with the county engineer and he confirmed that the Ridgemont Development's drainage plans were marginal at best. They assumed low water flow based on the drought conditions, not historical averages. That is a planning failure on their part, not your responsibility. Dr. Chen's report will be key. If she can show that you are just restoring normal conditions, the judge will have a hard time ruling against you. Monday morning, I put on my best suit, which I had not worn since Emma's funeral, and drove to the county courthouse in Fort Collins. Jim met me outside, looking confident in that way lawyers do when they think they have a winning case. Remember, stay calm. Answer questions directly, and do not let them rattle you. Patricia Whitmore is going to try to paint you as vindictive and irrational. We need to show that you are just a rancher trying to protect your water rights. The courtroom was old and formal, with wood paneling and high ceilings. Patricia Whitmore sat on the opposite side with 3 lawyers in expensive suits. She glared at me with pure hatred, and I met her gaze without flinching. She had started this war. I was just finishing it. The judge was a woman in her 60s named Margaret Holbrook. She had a reputation for being tough but fair, and she looked at both sides with the weary expression of someone who had seen every kind of dispute imaginable. The HOA's lead lawyer, a slick guy named Branson, who probably charged $500 an hour, went first. He painted a picture of a vindictive rancher who bought a dam purely to cause harm to his neighbors. He showed photos of flooded areas in Ridgemont Estates, water-damaged property, and a golf course with several holes underwater. Your Honor, Mr. Xavier deliberately increased the water flow to punishing levels, causing hundreds of thousands of dollars in damage to our client's property. This is not about water rights. This is about revenge. We ask the court to order an immediate reduction in the release rate and to hold Mr. Xavier liable for all damages. Judge Holbrook looked at me. Mr. Xavier, what do you have to say? Jim stood up. Your Honor, may I present evidence? For the next hour, Jim methodically demolished the HOA's case. He presented Dr. Chen's report showing that the current flow rate was consistent with 70 years of historical data. He showed documentation that the HOA's development had been built with inadequate drainage based on artificially low water flows. He presented my water rights, which predated the development by decades, and he showed evidence of the HOA's illegal diversions that had dried up my creek. Dr. Chen testified, explaining in clear terms that Clear Creek had carried this much water for generations and that the development should have been designed to handle it. The HOA essentially built in a floodplain while simultaneously creating the flood conditions by not accounting for normal water flow. Mr. Xavier is not causing the problem. He is simply no longer allowing the HOA to solve their planning failure by stealing his water. The judge listened intently, asking sharp questions. When Jim finished, she turned to the HOA's lawyers. Do you have any evidence that the current flow rate exceeds historical norms? Branson shuffled papers. Your Honor, the flow rate is clearly excessive. That was not my question. Do you have evidence that this flow rate exceeds what the creek carried historically? The recent conditions during which your clients were illegally diverting water from Mr. Xavier's property. Answer the question. No, Your Honor, but then your emergency injunction is denied. Mr. Xavier is operating the dam within historical parameters and exercising his legal water rights. If Ridgemont Estates has drainage problems, that is a consequence of poor planning, not Mr. Xavier's actions. This hearing is adjourned. I felt Jim's hand on my shoulder as we stood. Patricia Whitmore's face was purple with rage, and she was hissing something at her lawyers. We walked out of the courthouse into the bright morning sun, and I took my first deep breath in months. That was beautiful, I said. Jim grinned. She made it easy by being so obviously in the wrong. But this is not over, Sam. They're going to come at you harder now. He was right. Over the next 2 weeks, the HOA tried everything. They filed complaints with the State Water Board, claiming I was violating environmental regulations. The inspectors came out, reviewed everything, and found no violations. They filed a lawsuit claiming property damage, which Jim countered with my own lawsuit for their illegal water diversions. They tried to get the county to condemn the dam as unsafe, but a structural engineer inspected it and certified it was sound. Patricia Whitmore showed up at my ranch twice more. The first time, she brought her husband, a meek-looking accountant named Gerald, who clearly wanted to be anywhere else. She demanded I sell her the dam for $300,000. So you can shut off my water again? Not a chance. $400,000. Not for sale. You are being unreasonable. I am being unreasonable? You tried to destroy my ranch so your golf course could have more water. You offered to buy my land for a fraction of its value when I was desperate. You threatened me, harassed me, and treated me like garbage. And now you want me to help you? Get off my property. She left in a cloud of dust, tires spinning on the gravel driveway. Her second visit came with a different approach. She was alone, and her voice was softer, almost pleading. Mr. Xavier, can we please talk about this reasonably? Our community is suffering. Property values are dropping. People are upset. Can we not come to some kind of agreement? You should have thought about that before you diverted my creek. We made a mistake. We should have consulted with you. But this punishment does not fit the crime. You are destroying an entire community. I am not destroying anything. I'm just letting a creek flow the way it always has. If your community cannot handle that, maybe it should not have been built there." I softened my voice slightly. "Look, Mrs. Whitmore, I do not actually want to hurt anyone. I just want my ranch to survive. Your HOA tried to kill it. Now you have a problem because your development was not properly designed. That is not my responsibility to fix. What if we remove the diversions, let the creek flow naturally through our property? That would be a start, but I am not reducing the dam release. Clear Creek runs at 75 cubic feet per second. That is historical, that is normal, and that is what is going to continue." She left without another word, and I figured that would be the end of it. I was wrong. 3 days later, I got a call from Jim. His voice was tight with anger. "Sam, you need to get up to the dam right now. The HOA did something." I drove up the mountain road faster than I should have, my truck bouncing over ruts and rocks. When I reached the dam, I saw what had happened. Someone had tried to break into the control house. The door was damaged, the lock smashed, and there were pry marks around the frame. Inside, someone had attempted to force the release wheel closed, but they had not known what they were doing and had damaged the mechanism instead. The wheel was jammed, and worse, there was a small leak in one of the valve seals. I called Henry immediately. He arrived within the hour and assessed the damage. This is sabotage, pure and simple. Whoever did this knew enough to be dangerous, but not enough to do it right. The good news is, I can fix it. The bad news is, you need to file a police report. Sheriff Tom Duncan came out that afternoon. He was a big man in his 50s who had ranched before becoming a cop, and he took the break-in seriously. He photographed everything, dusted for fingerprints, and took my statement. "You got any idea who did this?" "The HOA wants me to reduce the water flow. They have been pressuring me for weeks. This is the kind of thing desperate people do." "Can you prove it was them?" "No, but who else would do it?" "I will investigate, but unless we get prints or a witness, it is going to be hard to charge anyone." He looked at the damaged equipment. "You should probably get some cameras up here. If they try again, at least you will have evidence." Henry and I spent the rest of the day repairing the damage and installing a security camera system powered by solar panels. The cameras covered the control house, the dam face, and the access road. If anyone came back, we would know. The footage came sooner than I expected. 2 nights later, the motion sensors triggered, and my phone buzzed with an alert. I pulled up the camera feed and watched as a pickup truck approached the dam. 2 men got out, both wearing dark clothing and baseball caps. They went straight to the control house and started trying to open the new lock I'd installed. I called Sheriff Duncan and then Jim Patterson. "It is happening again. I have them on camera right now." "Do not go up there alone," Jim said. "Wait for the sheriff." But I was already in my truck driving up the mountain road. I was not going to let someone destroy the one thing keeping my ranch alive. I drove without headlights, using the moonlight to navigate, and approached the dam quietly. The 2 men were still working on the lock, cursing and arguing in low voices. I stepped out of my truck and turned on my high beams, flooding the area with light. "That's far enough. The sheriff is on his way." Both men froze. One of them I did not recognize, but the other was Gerald Whitmore, Patricia's husband. He looked terrified, caught in the glare like a deer. "Mr. Xavier, we can explain..." "Explain what? That you are committing a felony. That is breaking and entering, destruction of property, and probably about 10 other charges." The other man bolted, running for the trees. Gerald just stood there, shoulders slumping. "She made me do it. Patricia said we had to stop you, that you were destroying everything. I told her this was a bad idea." Sheriff Duncan arrived 15 minutes later with a deputy. They caught the other man trying to hike down the mountain and brought him back in handcuffs. Gerald was arrested without resistance, looking miserable and defeated. "Mr. Xavier, we will need copies of your video footage," Sheriff Duncan said. "This is pretty clear-cut. Both of these guys are looking at serious charges." The news spread through Ridgemont Estates like wildfire. Patricia Whitmore's husband arrested for sabotage at the dam, the HOA president's family involved in criminal activity. Property owners started asking questions, demanding HOA board meetings, and threatening to sue the association for mismanagement. I got a call from a man named Robert Chen, one of the Ridgemont homeowners. "Mr. Xavier, I want to apologize on behalf of the reasonable residents of our community. Most of us had no idea what Patricia was doing. We just moved here and wanted a nice place to live. We did not know about the water theft or the harassment. I appreciate that, I said, but your community has caused me a lot of harm. I understand. A group of us are calling for Patricia's resignation and a complete review of the HOA's actions. We want to make this right. Is there any way we can negotiate a solution that works for everyone? I thought about it. The creek flows at 75 cubic feet per second. That is non-negotiable. But if your community wants to work with me on proper water management, maybe we can figure something out. Over the next month, things changed rapidly. Patricia Whitmore resigned as HOA president, facing both criminal charges for conspiracy in the sabotage and civil lawsuits from homeowners whose property had been damaged. Gerald Whitmore took a plea deal, testifying against the other man involved in receiving probation. The other man, who turned out to be the HOA's maintenance supervisor, got 6 months in jail. The new HOA board, led by Robert Chen, reached out to me through Jim Patterson. They proposed removing all the illegal diversions, redesigning their drainage system to handle normal creek flow, and establishing a good neighbor agreement that would prevent future conflicts. In exchange, they asked if I would consider allowing them access to some water during drought conditions, with proper compensation and legal agreements. We negotiated for 2 weeks. Dr. Chen was brought in as a neutral expert to design a system that would protect my water rights while allowing the development to function sustainably. The final agreement specified that Clear Creek would flow at no less than 75 cubic feet per second under normal conditions, with reductions only during severe drought as determined by state water authorities. The HOA would pay me an annual fee for any water they drew beyond natural flow-through, and they would maintain the creek's riparian areas on their property to improve the overall ecosystem. It was not perfect, but it was fair. Jim drew up the contracts, both sides signed, and just like that, the war was over. By late September, my ranch was thriving again. The hayfields had recovered enough to give me a decent cutting. My cattle were healthy and gaining weight. The creek flowed clear and strong, just like it had when I was a kid learning to fish with my grandfather. I spent an afternoon sitting on the bank, watching the water move over the rocks and feeling something close to peace. Sophia drove up from Denver that weekend. She had been worried sick during the whole conflict, calling me every few days to make sure I was okay. When she saw the ranch with the creek flowing and the fields green, she hugged me so hard I could barely breathe. "Dad, I was so scared you were going to lose everything." So was I, but sometimes you have to fight for what matters. We walked down to the creek together, and I told her the whole story, about buying the dam, the court hearing, the sabotage, and the final agreement. She listened, shaking her head in amazement. "You bought a dam! That's the most ridiculous and brilliant thing I have ever heard." "It was Henry's idea. I just did it. Mom would have loved this story, her telling you to fight back against bullies." Sophia smiled, and I saw Emma in her face. "So what are you going to do now? You own a dam. That is not something most ranchers can say." "Keep running it, I guess. Make sure the creek flows like it should. Maybe I will start giving tours." I laughed. "Samuel Xavier, dam owner and water rights advocate." The Mariah Dam became a strange point of pride for me. I hired a part-time maintenance guy to check on it regularly and keep the equipment in good shape. I installed better monitoring systems so I could track water levels and release rates from my phone. And I worked with the state water board to make sure everything was properly documented and legal. Over the winter, something unexpected happened. Other ranchers and property owners in the area started reaching out to me. They had their own water disputes, their own conflicts with developments or HOAs or neighboring properties. I was not a lawyer or an engineer, but I had learned a lot through my experience, and I was happy to share what I knew. Jim Patterson started referring people to me for initial consultations before they hired lawyers. By the following spring, I had become an unofficial advocate for agricultural water rights in our county. I testified at planning commission hearings when new developments were proposed, making sure water impacts were properly considered. I worked with conservation groups to improve creek health and riparian habitats, and I kept running my ranch, which was doing better than it had in years. The Ridgemont estate situation remained stable. The new HOA board kept their word, removing the illegal diversions and properly managing their water usage. A few homeowners even became friendly, waving when they drove past or stopping by to chat. Patricia Whitmore moved away, reportedly to Arizona, and I never heard from her again. Gerald Whitmore still lived in the development, keeping his head down and staying out of trouble. One afternoon in May, almost a year after I bought the dam, I drove up to check on it. The road was familiar now, and I knew every turn and bump. When I reached the dam, I parked and walked out onto the concrete apron, looking at the lake behind it and the valley below. Clear Creek wound through the landscape like a silver ribbon, feeding my ranch and continuing downstream to water other properties and eventually joining the Cache La Poudre River. I thought about my grandfather, who had bought this ranch with his savings from working in the coal mines. I thought about my father, who had built it into a profitable operation. I thought about Emma, who had loved this land as much as I did. And I thought about the future, about Sophia maybe coming back someday to run the place, about water flowing and grass growing and cattle grazing on hills that had supported my family for 3 generations. The HOA had tried to take that away from me. They had assumed that because they had money and lawyers and a gated community, they could push around some rancher and nobody would care. They were wrong. I had fought back with everything I had, risking bankruptcy and my family legacy on a crazy plan to buy a dam and redirect a river. It should not have worked. By all reasonable expectations, I should have lost everything. But sometimes crazy plans work out. Sometimes the little guy wins. And sometimes a dried-up creek starts flowing again because one stubborn rancher refused to give up. I adjusted the release valve slightly, fine-tuning the flow based on the spring snowmelt coming into the lake. The water rushing through the dam made its familiar deep rumble, and I felt it through my boots. This was my dam now, my water, my responsibility. And as long as I owned it, Clear Creek would flow the way it was supposed to, feeding the land and the people who depended on it. I drove back down to the ranch as the sun was setting, painting the mountains orange and gold. The cattle were settling in for the evening, and the creek gurgled along its banks. Everything was as it should be. The war was over, and I had won, not by destroying my enemies, but by refusing to be destroyed. The HOA had redirected the river away from my ranch, thinking they could take what was mine. So I bought the dam and sent it back, along with a message that some people will not be pushed around no matter how much money you have or how fancy your gated community is. My phone rang as I pulled into my driveway. It was Henry Blackthorne. "Sam, just checking in. How is everything looking up at the dam?" "Perfect. Water is flowing right where it belongs." "Good. You know, when I first suggested buying that dam, I was not sure you would actually do it. That took guts." "It took desperation," I said, "but I would do it again in a heartbeat." "Well, you made history around here. People are still talking about it. The rancher who bought a dam to save his land. That is the kind of story that gets told for generations." I smiled. I just hope it means something, that maybe the next time some HOA or developer thinks they can push people around and steal their water, they will remember what happened here and think twice. Oh, they will remember. Trust me, they will remember. We said goodbye, and I sat in my truck for a moment, looking at the ranch house where I had lived my entire life. The lights were on inside, warm and welcoming. Tomorrow I would be up before dawn, feeding cattle and fixing whatever had broken during the night. That was the reality of ranching, an endless cycle of work and weather and worry. But tonight, I could rest knowing that my land was secure, my water was flowing, and my family's legacy would continue. The HOA had learned an expensive lesson about water rights and the consequences of greed. Patricia Whitmore had lost her position, her reputation, and probably a fortune in legal fees. Gerald Whitmore had a criminal record. The Ridgemont Estates development had been forced to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars fixing their drainage problems and removing their illegal diversions. And all because they thought they could take what was not theirs. I got out of the truck and walked to the creek one more time. In the fading light, I could see the water moving steadily, reliably, exactly as it had for 100 years. This was what I had fought for. Not revenge, not victory, but simply the right to live and work on land that my family had earned through generations of hard labor and sacrifice. The fact that I had to buy a dam to protect that right was absurd, but I would do absurd things every day of the week if it meant keeping this ranch alive. A cool breeze came down from the mountains, carrying the scent of pine and fresh water. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, and my cattle shifted and settled. The earth kept turning, the seasons kept changing, and the creek kept flowing. That was all I needed. That was everything. I walked back to the house, my boots crunching on the gravel, and went inside to make dinner. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, as every day did on a ranch. But tonight, for the first time in almost a year, I felt truly at peace. The water was back, the land was healing, and I had proven that even in the face of money and power and legal threats, one person standing their ground could make a difference. The story of how the HOA redirected the river away from my ranch and how I bought the dam and sent it back became local legend. People stopped me in town to shake my hand or ask for advice. Reporters called wanting to do stories. I turned most of them down, but I agreed to one interview with the local paper because I wanted people to understand what had happened and why it mattered. The article ran with the headline, "Rancher Saves Land by Buying Dam," and told the whole story. It talked about water rights, about the conflicts between development and agriculture, about the importance of standing up for what was right even when the odds seemed impossible. The reporter, a young woman named Jessica who reminded me of Sophia, captured everything perfectly. After the article ran, I got letters from people all over the state, sharing their own stories of water disputes and property conflicts. Some asked for help, others just wanted to express their support. I read every letter and replied to as many as I could. If my fight could help even one other person protect their land and water, then everything I had been through was worth it. As the months passed and seasons changed, life settled into a comfortable rhythm. The ranch prospered with reliable water. The Ridgemont estates learned to coexist with their agricultural neighbor. The dam required maintenance and attention, but it was manageable. And I found a new purpose beyond just running my ranch, advocating for sensible water management and helping others navigate the complex world of water rights. Looking back, I realized that the moment Patricia Whitmore first showed up at my ranch in her white Mercedes was the beginning of a journey I never expected to take. She thought she was delivering a message about the HOA's intentions. What she actually did was challenge me to fight for everything I believed in. And I did fight, in ways I never imagined possible, right up to the point where buying a dam seemed like the only logical solution. The irony was not lost on me. The HOA had tried to control the water by building diversions and claiming rights they did not have. In response, I had gone further upstream and taken control at the source. They played checkers while I played chess, and in the end, the natural flow of the river won out over artificial manipulation. Water, I learned, follows the laws of gravity and nature, not the rules of homeowner associations. My job was simply to make sure those natural laws could do what they were meant to do. As I stood by the creek on that warm evening, watching the sun disappear behind the mountains and the stars begin to emerge, I thought about all the people who had helped me along the way. Henry Blackthorne, who saw the solution when I could not. Jim Patterson, who fought the legal battles with skill and determination. Dr. Chen, who provided the scientific evidence that won the case. Sheriff Duncan, who took the sabotage seriously and held people accountable. And even Robert Chen and the reasonable homeowners of Ridgemont Estates, who ultimately did the right thing and worked toward a fair solution. The fight had cost me almost everything I had, financially speaking. My savings were gone, my retirement accounts depleted, and I was carrying debt that would take years to pay off. But I still had my ranch, my water, and my dignity. Those things were worth more than money, and I would make the same choice again without hesitation. The creek continued its eternal journey from the mountains to the plains, indifferent to the human dramas that played out along its banks. It had flowed before I was born, and it would flow after I was gone. My contribution was simply to ensure that for this brief moment in geological time, it could follow its natural course without interference from those who saw it as nothing more than a resource to be exploited. That felt like enough of a legacy for me. A rancher who fought for a river and won. A man who refused to let his family's land die without a fight. A dam owner who sent the water back where it belonged, because sometimes the right thing to do is also the crazy thing to do, and you just have to trust that it will work out in the end. And it did work out. better than I had any right to expect. The water flowed, the grass grew, the cattle thrived, and life continued on my ranch in the foothills of the Rockies, sustained by a creek that almost died but was brought back to life by one desperate, stubborn, and ultimately successful act of defiance against an HOA that thought it could take what was not theirs. They learned otherwise, and the lesson was expensive for them but priceless for everyone else who might face similar battles in the future. Stand your ground. Fight smart, and never underestimate what a determined person can accomplish when everything they love is on the line.